why. Always why. Why did this killer kill? Who was the gunman, 28-year-old Ian Long? And why did he target fellow young people? What allows a mind like that to separate itself from reality? Joining me now from Malibu, California, exactly 19 miles south of the scene of that shooting, forensic psychiatrist Dr. Carole Lieberman. Doctor, you know, people are pointing to PTSD, and that's understandable. If this person was diagnosed with PTSD, it's an illness, but it's no excuse. It's no more an excuse than if you had bipolar syndrome. There's a certain accounting for your actions in a civilized society. And to write it off just because of PTSD, I think, is wrong. It's also wrong what Gavin Newsom is doing and writing it off as being about guns are bad. It's just not that simple to stereotype in any direction a situation like this.
Absolutely. I mean, of course, you know, every time there's some kind of a shooting, that's what comes up. You know, we need to get rid of the guns and then we won't have these shootings. It's not about the guns. It's about the problems that are causing these people to do these shooting rampages in the first place. And this starts off, there are a lot of things that go into this mix that ultimately cause someone to become a shooter, like we just saw. Starting with problems in the home, it starts when the person is young. They might be abused. They might have an alcoholic parent. The parents might get divorced. There are all kinds of things that happen. They might be bullied in school. We're not also taking into consideration the fact that all the media, all the violent media that kids see by the time, you know, especially young men, especially news, you know, so we've seen, for example, this is very much like the Pulse nightclub, right, or movies or video games. All of these things are like the script that give these kids who have been angry at society, the way that tells them how to do it, how to get revenge.
This was my first reaction, is a young man, a millennial type, who may be trying to extol revenge, living out almost a fantasy video game, unfortunately very real for the victims in that nightclub. But over the past 10 years or more, we've seen a pattern here, but certainly over the last 10 years, of men in this country in their mid to late 20s. Many of them are behind the more recent mass shootings. I don't remember this happening this way in the 1980s. I don't remember it happening in the 1990s this way. Is it, how do you quantify it, Doctor? Is it a developmental issue? Is it a societal issue? Is it a millennial issue? And I'm not harping on the millennials, and I'll get into that in just a minute, but the millennials are victims of their parents, of how their parents raised them. Is there a correlation there?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you know, as I was saying, a lot of parents really aren't paying enough attention to what their kids are doing. Millennial parents, or their divorce really has a lot to do with it. If you look at the history of these kinds of shootings, most of the shootings shooters have had divorced parents, which makes their world fall apart. It's also the fact that the larger world seems to be falling apart for these millennials. You know, they're confronting a lot of unrest in the world, a lot of chaos, global warming, nuclear powers. There's a lot. There are not terrorism, you know, ISIS-type terrorism. There are all of these threats out there, and they feel somewhat angry that the world that they're being handed isn't the kind of world that's going to allow for them to be successful and happy. And, you know, 30, what's very interesting is that 30 is a time when people generally set a deadline for themselves. A lot of people say they want to be married by 30, or they want to have a good paying job by 30, or a house, or even some people think they want to have kids by 30. So as people get close to 30, and if they're nowhere near these kinds of things happening, like this shooter was, you know, living with his mother, apparently probably jealous of the college students in there, having relationships. Right. That's kind of, they feel like it's feeling like there's nothing left to lose.
Life is not fair. It's what you just mentioned there, that essentially that life is not fair to this generation. Is fascinating to me, because when you look at many of the parents and the way they raised these children, everything was handed to them. And I know that the older generation usually looks at the next generation and says, oh, you have it easy. You know, you weren't trudging through the snow on your way to school. But that's not what I mean. I mean literally the helicopter parents and things being handed to them on a silver platter. And when I raised a millennial, so I understand what's going on here, and I witnessed this firsthand. I tried not to do it to my child, but they're different. This is a different generation. And again, I hate to bag on the millennial generation, but I run through a few things with you, Carole. Number one, video games. This is a very important issue that I don't think parents understand. When you come home from school and you allow kids to play video games hour upon hour upon hour, there's nothing good in that. I remember I would come home from school and my mom would say, go outside and play. I don't know how often that happens anymore in this republic. Next thing is these baby kids from the beginning, and now saying that life isn't fair when they're older and they're adult, given these participation trophies. Well, we all know in life you don't get a participation trophy. You have to deal with reality. Instant gratification generation, Carole. These parents who, I see it today. You know, you sit down in the restaurant and they'll hand their kid a phone, or they'll hand their kid a tablet instead of engaging them. It's absolute, to me, it's absolute child abuse. Put the graphic back on, if you would, because I'm not done yet. I want to go through a little bit more, a couple more things on that graphic. And what this does, Carole, when you have the instant gratification and giving them the phones at the table, is it screws up their ability to interact. You know, I try to interact with millennials every day. I'm not going to tell you how or where. And it's painful for them to interact with older people. They don't make eye contact. They never broach a conversation with you. You have to do it. Well, that's a warning sign to me, Carole. And finally, one more thing, and then I'm going to let you talk. God. God is missing from this equation. Many of these kids, now adults, were raised without religion. Yeah, they were raised in possibly a broken household, or maybe a home with only one parent. You know, we've got to start connecting the dots here as a society and figure out what the common denominators are. Don't you agree?
I agree with all of the things that you mentioned, and it's so much easier to just say, let's get rid of the guns, than it is to let's be better parents. And it's interesting, you know, there are a lot of helicopter parents that are giving the kids, you know, participation trophies and all of that kind of stuff that makes it too easy. And then they get out in the real world and they realize, well, wait a second, no one's giving me a participation trophy for just showing up. But it's also, there are also parents, it's like a combination. There's two extremes. The helicopter parents rewarding them for nothing, and then parents who really aren't paying attention with them, like you were saying about, you know, whether it's watching video games, watching television, giving them the phone, so that the parents don't have to deal with them and they can go on and do their own things. Because part of the problem is that parents are feeling as though they want to get more for themselves, that they had more things in life that they wanted to do. And so go watch television, go play a video game, go pay attention to your phone instead of talking to us. You know, the dinners are gone. That's another thing to mention. The dinners where you ask your child, you know, what did you do in school? How are you feeling? What's happening with you these days? Being able to get psychiatrists involved at a much earlier time. Like, real obviously, the people in this case should have taken him to a psychiatric hospital against his will if he didn't want to go. I mean, we're seeing this with the Parkland shooter. We're seeing this with lots of shooters, that they aren't getting enough good psychiatric treatment to have been able to catch these things at a much younger age.
We don't know what drove Ian Long to do this necessarily, and I don't want to speculate at all, but we do know that he falls within a trend here, and that trend is what I talked about on the onset, and that is younger millennial men committing these atrocities. We do know this as well, that there are X amount of parents out there who raise millennials who are living in a total fantasy land. And they get out in the real world and they can't handle it. And there's nothing we can do about it. There's absolutely nothing we can do about it. And the only people we can blame are the people in the mirror. That's it, Carole. Thank you.